Good evening. There's so much that could be said for a Child Haven update, and I always struggle with which part of it do you want to hear. So if you just want to sit here all night, we can get all of the details. But no, I'll try to concisely put together what I think maybe you're most interested in and what kind of sets a direction for where Child Haven is headed and your participation or your role and your part in that. And I did bring some of our newly revamped brochures and put those on each table in the back, and our latest newsletter, which just was mailed out last week. And we had a little issue with some addresses on that mailing list, but there's a handful of those in the back, and so there's some financial information and things like that in there. So if you have questions that I don't cover in our brief talk tonight, then you can look at those things, and certainly you can contact me and I'll answer any of those questions that you may have. Child Haven has traditionally been known as a children's home, classically an orphanage, although for a number of years now it is the case that very few children that are placed at Child Haven and other children's homes aren't really true orphans. You know, with the medical advancements that we've made and the way people live much longer, and many of these youth are not in a residential home because they don't have parents, sadly, and that's sad enough, but sadly many of them are in a home because they have been abused and neglected and cannot remain with those who are supposed to be the ones who will care for them and raise them and nurture them and care for them. And so it's the case that sort of the nature of Christian child care, shall we say, has shifted over the years. And at Child Haven, we're looking in the direction of and looking forward in specifically understanding the trauma that the children have faced and how to combat that and how that affects them spiritually and how we can reach them spiritually as an evangelistic way of looking through what does that child abuse and neglect, what does that do to your future in terms of spiritual development, and how do we reach through that? And so I want to tonight invite your attention to Luke chapter 10, to a passage that you're all familiar with, and the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I want to do what I think is probably the best way to approach a parable and kind of put together looking at this parable with this Child Haven update. And the way that you go about, I think better as I move, so I'm going to do that. The way that you go about making application of a parable is to put yourself in the parable. To say, which character am I in the parable? I hope that as we go through that you can do that personally, right? At the end of our discussion tonight, we'll extend the invitation. And I hope that you've kind of thought through the parable of the Good Samaritan and thought, now, which character am I in the story? But what I want to do in making application to Child Haven is kind of tell you about the characters in the story as far as Child Haven goes, and your relationship to Child Haven and the children that we serve at Child Haven. And just sort of go through that parable and make application to us by asking the question of, if I'm in that parable, who am I? Now, we're all familiar with the parable because it is a parable that Jesus tells that is about this man who's traveling to Jerusalem, and he is robbed and beaten, and he's left for dead on the side of the road. You know, just last night, I didn't come across a man robbed and beaten and on the side of the road, but in the late evening hours, as my wife and I were coming back from our anniversary dinner, I passed this car on the side of the road with the lights flashing and two guys standing on the side of the road. And as we passed by, I thought, should I have stopped? Am I not being a good Samaritan? Now, they were on their cell phones, so I figured they're talking to somebody. I'm not a mechanic, so it seems like they're taken care of. But we understand, right, what it's like to come across someone who is in need. And here's a man who was robbed and beaten and left for dead. And then there's two characters in the parable, the priest and the Levite, and they pass by. And then there's the Good Samaritan who stops, bandages the man's wounds, picks him up, places him on his animal, carries him to an inn, and leaves him at the inn and leaves money so that if there are any needs, right, this man can be cared for. And he even says, I'll come back to check on him, and if there's more that was needed, I'll pay for that. I'll provide that as well. So those are the characters of the story, right? And sometimes I have been, and I imagine you as well, I have been maybe not robbed and beaten and left for dead, but I've been the person who needed a good Samaritan to help me out, right? When it comes to Child Haven and the work that we do, the first character that I can relate to is that man that is robbed and beaten and left for dead. And in thinking about this parable and comparing it, I see in that man who's robbed and beaten and left for dead, I see the children that we serve at Child Haven. Right now, our campus is all females, and they are ages 14 and up. We have what's called a basic program. We have 2 houses that are considered basic. And that just means it's not a treatment facility, and their psychological needs and behavioral needs aren't to the point of what the state calls moderate and intensive. My house parents don't like the fact that those 2 houses are called basic, because there's nothing basic about having 8 teenage girls in a home that have a history of abuse and neglect, and that have been in the foster care system for a number of years and have moved to different foster placements, who have no chance of probably being adopted. They really don't have much of a chance of even being fostered by an individual family. Teenagers are very hard to place in individual foster homes. And then you bring 8 of them together in one of our homes, and our house parents just, like the word basic, right? And so when I think about this man that is robbed and beaten and left on the side of the road, I think about these girls, and I think about their wounds. Their wounds. And those wounds are, sometimes they've been physical, right? Some of their history has involved physical abuse, broken bones, neglect to the point of malnourishment, right? Or medical needs, healthcare needs that weren't addressed at various times. Some of them have been exposed to drugs Some of them exposed to drugs before they were even born, while they were still in their mother's womb. Some of them, at a very early ages, were exposed to hard drugs because it was being used in the household and people passed out and just left drugs there. And so I think about the wounds that they've experienced. And of course, all of those things have led to not just the physical abuse and the neglect, but the psychological. You know that those who experience abuse and neglect in childhood, those who experience adverse childhood experiences is what the research calls them, are much more likely, even as adults, to have serious mental health problems, to be diagnosed with depression and to be diagnosed with anxiety. But not only that, to be diagnosed with all number of chronic illnesses, from heart disease to cancers to just about any chronic illness that you can name. And so when I think about applying the parable of the Good Samaritan, and I think about this man on the side of the road beaten and left for dead, I think about these youth that we serve. And I think about their wounds that, yes, have been physical, but when we get them, they are deep-seated wounds that are emotional, that are psychological, that are relational, and that are spiritual. You see, that history of trauma and abuse and neglect creates poor relationships. It creates inappropriate social skills. It encourages a lack of motivation. They've lived in survival mode for so long that they just continue to do what they do for survival. They don't see a future for themselves. There's no motivation for applying yourself at school and for developing things that would move you toward a better life, because their brains have been wired to just survive now. There's a lack of self-esteem. There's a feeling isolated and lonely and no sense of belonging and feeling hopeless and making poor decisions. And they're vulnerable to further abuse and to peer pressure. And there's very poor problem-solving skills. There's impulsivity, hyperarousal, and a ton of anger. A ton of anger. Now, I don't know how that man on the side of the road that was beaten and left for dead felt emotionally. I can't imagine that he was very thrilled about the experience that he'd had. And I can imagine, I can see that as he's healing in that bed in the inn, that there is some anger about what's happened to him. Maybe there's anger about the fact that people passed by and didn't help. Certainly there's probably anger about how someone could do this to him. Maybe there's anger about how the world could be the kind of place where this kind of thing can happen. See, that's what happens. That's the spiritual wound that occurs so frequently with these youth that we serve. How in the world is it the case that the world could be such a place where an innocent child, through no fault of their own, could experience horrific abuse and neglect? Sadly, sometimes even sexual abuse. How? So there's all kinds of confusion. Now, I imagine many of us as adults can have a little bit of a challenge in reconciling, right? Good God, right? With that kind of thing happening to innocent children. And there's there are books written on the problem, whole books written on the problem of evil, pain, and suffering to reconcile those things. But imagine if you're a child And you've experienced those things. And then we try to introduce you to religion, and we try to introduce you to God, and yet your experience has been that the world is such a place where children can suffer tremendously. There's a spiritual wound there that has to be addressed. And so I think about applying this parable, and the first thing I see are the young people that we serve, the girls that we serve. I see them wounded and beaten and left for dead. Somebody, right? Somebody has to come along and care for them. Somebody has to pick them up, and somebody has to show them that, yes, while there are people that do those things to children in this world, there is a God who loves you and cares for you, and to show them the love of Christ. And that's what we're trying to do at Child Haven. That's what you're trying to do by supporting that kind of work and being a part of that kind of work, and the many other good works that you're a part of. And so, as I apply the parable of the Good Samaritan, I see those girls as the wounded, and I see you. I see you as the Good Samaritan. Right? Because, yes, while you didn't pick that girl up, you are making provision for. Maybe it's 2 denarii like the Good Samaritan, or maybe it's less, maybe it's more. Doesn't really matter. You're being a Good Samaritan. You are a part of the process of picking up the wounded and bandaging them. My staff at Child Haven are certainly Good Samaritans, because you don't do that kind of work. You don't take in 8 teenage girls who've been abused, and teenagers are a challenge already. No offense to you teenagers. My son is 13. He's never experienced what it's like to be abused and neglected, although if you ask him, he would probably, in that 13-year-old teenage drama, suggest to you that maybe I've been cruel a time or two. But these parents who are willing to do that, who are willing to move into one of our homes and to day in and day out take care of these girls, they're Good Samaritans. They're Good Samaritans like you. They care. They're picking these girls up. They're bandaging them. Many times we wish that it could be as easy as bandaging a physical wound, right? Putting on a Band-Aid, setting a bone, right? Not to make light of those kinds of wounds, but it's much more challenging to get to those deep emotional, psychological, and spiritual wounds. It takes Good Samaritans with patience to reach that. And so when I look at the parable of the Good Samaritan, I see the girls that we serve, I see a bunch of Good Samaritans, and I see the inn. And I see Child Haven's job as the inn, right? Because these youth who are in need are brought to us, and it's the Good Samaritans like you that make provisions for the work through your participation in the Thanksgiving appeal, or through your monthly help, or through the times where maybe you just gather some food items and bring them, or whatever. But we're the inn, and the inn doesn't get to take care of the wounded without that provision being made. And so thank you. But there are other characters in this parable as well, right? There's the priest and the Levite. And the priest and the Levite, they passed by. What I find interesting in the parable is that Jesus does not tell you why they passed by. Which is the first question I have. Right? When you're reading the parable, my curious mind, that's the first question I have. Well, why'd they pass by? And maybe Jesus doesn't tell us why, because you're supposed to ponder the various reasons why. Because the point isn't so much that there is a reason why someone would pass by. Maybe the point is that people pass by all of the time and fail to be the Good Samaritans all of the time for various reasons. And so if you're making the application and you say, well, it turns out that I'm the priest and the Levite. See, it doesn't particularly matter why the priest and the Levite passed by. The question then becomes, why did you pass by? Why am I the priest or the Levite? And what makes that even more of a punch to the gut is that the priest and the Levite are supposed to be the religious people, right? They're supposed to be the example to everybody else. If anybody passes by, it's not supposed to be them. If anybody cares about children being abused and having these psychological, emotional, and spiritual wounds, it should be the people of God, right? That's why I'm so thrilled to be a part of the work at Child Haven. Child Haven has been a work of the churches of Christ, going all the way back to 1949. And even today, 70%, almost 70% of the funds that allow us to do what we do and that sustain Child Haven are from churches and individual Christians. But in the parable, it's religious people that passed by. Why? Jesus doesn't say. But there are some reasons why people might see such a problem, see those who are wounded, and not do anything about it. One of those reasons could be fear. Could be fear. I'll admit, when it was late at night and I'm driving down the road, just me and my wife, and I see that car on the side of the road with their flashers on, there was some fear. There was the question of what might happen to me if I stop. And there's always fear when it comes to the wounded. Maybe the priest and the Levite, maybe they looked and maybe they said, if I stop, I'll be robbed and beaten. Maybe they thought it's a setup. Or maybe even if they didn't think it was a setup, maybe they said, well, but if I stop, if I slow down, I could end up just like that guy. The fear, I think, sometimes when we see the children who are abused and neglected, the fear is, I'll make it worse. If I intervene, I'll make it worse. If you care and you love them, you're not going to make it worse. You can't make it worse. Another reason why some might pass by or not stop and help, sometimes is contempt. Sometimes it's contempt. Sometimes we have a tendency to look down upon people, look down our noses at them. In fact, the context of the parable suggests that there is an element of that at play. Because the Jews and the Samaritans had a history of contempt for one another. They hated one another. They were enemies with one another. And it's this Jewish man who is engaging Jesus, where Jesus tells this parable. And interestingly enough, Jesus makes the hero of the parable, because he closes out the parable by telling this Jewish man, you go and do likewise. Right? He makes the hero of the parable a guy that this Jew probably had contempt for. Go be like the guy you view as your enemy. There's quite a bit of irony there. You ever look at people who are wounded and find yourself going, well, they probably did something to deserve that? If they were better, if they were a better person, you wouldn't be in that state. Well, we do know that going down a path of sin can lead to heartache and bring more problems upon us. But it's also the case, and especially, right, when we're thinking about wounded children, that just doesn't cut it, does it? There's no reason to look upon them with contempt. They haven't done anything to deserve that. Now, as teenagers, right, they've developed very, very poor coping skills and very, very challenging behaviors that compound their troubles and their problems, but they're in the situation they're in because of adults. Another reason why some might pass by, and maybe this is the priest and the Levite, ambivalence. Right? I'm living my life. This is not a problem that's particularly prevalent in my life. So I'll deal with the things that affect me directly and just sort of pretend like that's not there. I don't know. Maybe that's the priest and the Levite. Although, I think there's another one, and you can probably think of some more, but there's another one that I think probably is one of the biggest reasons why we might, in this particular application, find ourselves as the priest or the Levite, and that is just ignorance. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. And I'll be honest with you, the only reason that I have some inkling of what to do is because I was trained as a licensed counselor, and I worked for several years counseling specifically children and families where there was abuse and neglect, especially in the area of sexual abuse. And I spent some time as a forensic interviewer where I was actually gathering the story of the abuse to be able to testify in court and to relate what had happened and participate in the investigation of abuse and neglect. And it's only through that I really began to develop any kind of understanding of how exactly you start to respond to the wounds that are emotional, that are psychological, that are affecting these children who are abused and neglected. So at Child Haven, we're becoming more of a program in the sense of we are being very intentional about bandaging these wounds rather than just being a place where these girls are provided a place to live. We are being more intentional about, yes, this is a place for you to live, but what are those needs that are psychological and emotional and spiritual? And how can we really, truly delve deeper into bandaging those things? In fact, most of the girls in our care are going to age out of the system. They're in the foster care system. That means they're not going to be adopted. They're not going to be moved to individual foster homes. They are going to be in the foster care system until they turn 21. And then when they turn 21, the system is no longer there to support them. And so when I say that we are becoming more and more of a program, we have a program in place to immediately start not only making sure these girls get the counseling that they need for these emotional wounds, but they're so far behind in developing the normal, I say normal, the typical process of basic living skills, right? And so immediately we start through this process of what do you know in terms of how to take care of yourself on a daily basis, and what do you need to know, right? And we go all the way back to hygiene, and we build, and we build, and we build, because we know that when you turn 21, you've already had this major setback because your childhood has been about abuse and neglect. So you've already got that major setback, but, you know, most of us, when we turned 21, we still had someone to fall back on. You know, when I took off out into the world at 18, but the only reason why I could do that is because I knew Mom and Dad were there. And there's a number of times that they have been there for me since then. But you think about, you've been a victim of abuse and neglect, you're about to turn 21, and you are on your own in the world. And so we're addressing those things. We move those girls from our basic program where we're teaching them those things, getting them ready for a transitional living where we give them a little less supervision. We help them after they graduate high school to make sure they get jobs, make sure they're pursuing education, and then we help move them into an apartment, and hopefully when they turn 21, they're set already, right? They have an apartment, they have a job, they're moving on. So, again, taking the parable, making application to our story. I want to thank you for recognizing the work that has been done and is being done at Child Haven. I want to thank you for your Good Samaritan heart and for your participation in that work, for your 2 denarii or however much that you can bring to the table to participate in the end, continuing to care for these girls. I want to extend the invitation by kind of going back to where we started. And that is, again, you make an application of the parable by putting yourself into it. So we've talked about our girls. We've talked about the Good Samaritans. We've talked about the inn. We've talked about the people that sometimes pass by. There's another character that I want to draw your attention to. And that's the person to whom Jesus is telling the story. He's not actually in the parable, but he's the reason why Jesus tells the parable, right? And I alluded to him a moment ago. So let's put the parable back into the context. And verse 25 says that a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, to put Jesus to the test. And he says, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Man, that's a fantastic question, right? That is the most important question. The problem is, this guy is not interested in the answer to that question. As a side note, most of our girls that we serve at Child Haven aren't interested in the answer to that question. There's a reality that this abuse and neglect, and it's a lot to overcome to get them to be interested in spiritual things. We're striving to do that. But this lawyer doesn't have pure motives either, because he asks because he wants to test Jesus. And Jesus says, well, what's written in the law? How do you read it? You're a lawyer. You read it. What does it say? And he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, you've answered correctly. Do this and you will live. Matthew's account, Matthew says in Matthew 22 and verse 40, that upon this hang all the law and the prophets. You want to summarize up everything that is said about your responsibility to God? It's love God with everything that you are and love your neighbor as yourself. If you love God with everything that you are, you'll be obedient to Him. If you love Him with everything that you are, then guess what? You're going to love people, because people are made in God's image. And every law that you can think about, everything that God says He wants you to do is about loving God or loving your neighbor. But sadly, verse 29, but he, that is that lawyer, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, who is my neighbor? Desiring to justify himself. That means his follow-up question was also not an honest follow-up question. He didn't really care he wasn't really interested in knowing who his neighbor was. He was trying to justify himself, which means he already knew deep down in his heart that he was not a good neighbor. He probably had some people that he could think of and name off the top of his head that he didn't care for, he didn't love, he didn't treat properly. And instead of wanting to change himself to be what the law asked him to be what God desired of him to be what he knew he should be, instead of wanting to change himself, he wanted to justify himself. He wanted to come up with some loophole, some reason why he could say, well, I'm okay even though I don't. And so Jesus tells him this parable that we've looked at. And he says, you go and do likewise. It's not a time for excuses. It's not a time for you to come up with some reasons why you can't intervene and help when that person is wounded and they are beaten and they are left for dead. You can't justify it. You go and you do likewise. And that's the invitation to us this evening. As you think about the parable and you put yourself in it, are you the kind of person that's going to look at this parable and go, if I'm falling short, here are the reasons why I don't do that? Or are you going to be the kind of person that looks at it and goes, if I'm falling short, I'm going to make changes. I'm going to do what I need to do to love God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love my neighbor as myself. And I know we've been talking about Child Haven, and I appreciate your relationship with Child Haven and this continued partnership. But man, it's so much bigger than that, isn't it? To love your neighbor as yourself, day in, day out, at work, at school, in your community. That's what this is really about. And John would point out that you can't really claim that you love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength unless you have love for one another. So I encourage you, as we stand and sing, to respond if there is a need that you've been made aware of through our study of the Good Samaritan.